Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. Today I'm massively excited. I'm massively excited for all my episodes, but I think doubly today. I'm joined by Rob Gray, who is a associate professor in human systems at Arizona State University. As much as Rob might be modest in saying this, certainly I regard Rob as one of the sort of foremost experts in this area insofar as all things constraint-based coaching, and it's just a delight to have him on. Rob, firstly, how are you? Just before we get going.
I'm doing well, Mark, and I thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm doing well. It's like we said, it's a little warmer here than where you are, but I'm hanging in there. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, geez, the West Coast. I know that absolutely is the case. So I'd mentioned just briefly off air, Rob, about some of my own selfish reasons for actually having this conversation, because like any coach, there's sort of burning things in the back of my head that I want to be able to ask people who know the most or a lot more than maybe the average Joe, and this is one area I think that's taken off, certainly in the UK. I think we became a lot more cognizant of specific approaches to style acquisition and the sort of different pedagogical models, and if coaches aren't so much understanding the underpinning theory and philosophy behind the way they set up the practices, the way they plan their practices and reflect on it, there is certainly an increased sort of working knowledge and at the very least a desire to give things a go. And I think one of the things that certainly has caught on amongst coaches over here is this sort of ecological approach, this sort of view on style as being emergent or self-organized and all those sorts of words. They are very commonplace now in a lot of conversations. But there's always so much more to understand. I've read one of your, I think, 3 books, and there's a 4th one coming out. So the copy I've got is, you won't be able to see it because of my screen, Learning to Optimize Movement, and that takes things in an even deeper level. So I want this conversation, I suppose, because, as I've said, coaches are very curious already. So I think there's enough resources online already for coaches to go and get that sort of introduction to constraint space. So we're kind of instead going to chat through some questions I have, maybe about some misconceptions, or maybe actually for those academics or even coaches that are what have more of an interest in understanding where the recommendations come from. We'll chat a little bit more at that level. And please help me when I'm struggling, because I'm saying this.
Sounds good.
I teach on this, but I'm saying it's still something that's really difficult. So I'm saying that, but to kick us off, just for those who maybe do just want that very brief introduction to what on earth we're talking about with constraint space before we then step over to some of the wider sort of understandings and the nuance. Could I challenge you just very firstly, just what do we mean by constraint space coaching? If we could give that overview, just, very briefly, first and foremost.
Yeah. So I guess simply the constraint space approach it starts with the idea that the fundamental idea of self-organization, right? We're going to let the athlete find the technique or movement solution themselves instead of trying to tell them here's how you shoot a free throw, or here's how you do a forehand in tennis. We're going to let them find it themselves. We're going to allow for a little variation. So the constraints rate approach, instead of giving lots of technical instructions, bend your arm like this, do this with your elbow, we're going to kind of let the practice design do more of a talking for us. So a constraint is something we add to practice that is going to kind of help channel the person's search and for a new a movement solution. So we're using our knowledge as a coach, and we can change lots of different things, with if it's team sport, the size and the number of players, individual sports, the equipment, there's lots of these constraints we can change. But the idea is, instead of giving the person, here's the way to do it, we're kind of adding something to practice to kind of channel them to explore themselves.
Okay, so that's maybe this is maybe an apt word, a cue, or if that's a controversial word, but that's a cue for me to actually ask you around one of the sort of questions I see thrown up quite a lot when we're talking about different constraints that we can put in to push the athlete away from what isn't helpful for the organisation of the movement and more towards the affordances, these sorts of things. I think a lot of coaches, certainly in terms of the ones I've been involved with and interacted with, and even in my own practice. The idea of task constraints and how we can manipulate the rules of a drill, and even the idea of an environment constraints in terms of what the environment's, forcing us to do. And I know sometimes we can get into semantics here, but different. It could be. And to be fair, I get back and forward between this. Is this a task constraint or not? Is it the surface you're on? All these sorts of things. I know for the moment we can just assume that doesn't matter so much. The one that I think people, and certainly myself, and I'm really curious to know a little bit more on, is the sort of, I think you fashion it as organismic, or essentially person constraints. What is that? Because that, I think, seems like a more underused constraint, or perhaps we're not always fully aware that we're already using that, and when we're planning exercises and trying to challenge our athletes.
Yeah, so those individual or organismic constraints are kind of what the athlete brings to the table. So there's two main types. Are their physical dimensions, like how tall are they, how long are their arms, how long, and their action capacity, how flexible are they, how strong are they, how fast can they run. All of those things, the way I like to think of it, those act as kind of act as limiters, or they constrain possible movement solutions you can use. The example I always give is I'm 5'9", so when I play basketball, dunking a basketball is not a solution that's available to me because of my individual constraints. There's nothing you could do about the game or the number of players or anything other than lowering the hoop that can make me dunk. That's a solution that's not available to me. I don't have the height or the jumping capacity to do that. So individual constraints are kind of what the athlete brings. And so it's on the short term, it's pretty hard to influence them directly. Over the long term, we can target things in strength and conditioning and kind of build on these things, giving the athlete the potential to be more skillful.
So could that be, as one example as well, some of the shorter guys against some of the taller guys in a team? Or could it also extend to emotional characteristics, confidence, pressure? Is that a personal
for sure
constraint?
Yeah, that's one I kind of left out. The psychological, how you handle pressure, your motivation, those kind of things. I would lump in individual constraints as well. We can develop those as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's one part, and if you look at any of the sort of stuff, Chris Harwood's got a lot of stuff around sort of 5 C's of coaching, and it's sort of like a quite a deliberate effort to try and channel and train mental skills within exercises that may at their sort of more outside look might look and appear like a passing exercise, but actually it's in front of people and it's deliberate in that way that it's getting done, because we're trying to induce some state of anxiety and things like that. But again, it's just interesting that we can think holistically in the way we view a constraint in the person in that way, that it's not just their skill level technically and tactily, or even the dimensions, but it's also their emotional states and how we can manipulate that. Yeah.
So, and that's something we often don't think about in practice. We leave those things out. Competition is very high pressure, high anxiety, and practice is very relaxed and not much pressure. So we want to try to incorporate that whenever we can.
Yeah, I mean, competition sounds really potent in itself, I suppose. Like, maybe ordinarily we aren't focused on the result, but you know what, this week we're wanting you to win. Maybe if you're one of my youth players, and it's not with any reason other than to see how they organise around that constraint, which then might bring forward maybe certain emotions and things that are quite difficult and they need to sort of leverage and work with. So now that was one thing. It's interesting that. What I would like to kind of move on to is, we all, I think, are able to understand the constraint-based approach in a way that you'll hear about, that's certainly fed through the readings, or at least what we can glean from reading. But then it's about the application of it, and I think sometimes, or at least this is a question that I'm posing, and I'm really curious to know your thoughts on, is, does it get misinterpreted what constraint-based coaching is, or is there maybe misapplication of it that maybe we could highlight that would help a coach who hopes to be acting in a constraint-based manner to really actually, see that and in the real world? So what's your thoughts on that? Just, I'm wondering how you feel around it.
Yeah, I think there's a few misconceptions. One of them is that constraints-based coaching is just games. You can only play games. You can't learn any other way. That's not the case. You can do more technical drills using a constraints-based approach just as well. The other one I find very common is constraints-based coach means you just design a practice and you stand back and you let athlete do whatever they want. Even if they have no success or they do something that might hurt them, you just stand back and you don't say anything. That's not the case either. We don't want you to say as much, like constantly correcting an athlete, but a constraints-based approach doesn't mean you can't step in, and you can either, there's lots of different ways. In the constraints-based approach, what you say is actually a type of constraint as a coach. The instructions you give, it constrains it. So you can, the way I like to pose it to coaches, I think of you're the guy, you're guiding their self-organization. So if they're not adapting to the constraints you designed the way you want, you can change them, or you can give them a cue to try something different. So those are a couple of the big ones I see people. And then the other one is some people like constraints kind of just unprincipled. Let's throw a lot of different let's throw a smaller ball in a bigger field, and without much thought as to why, right? The constraints that approach is really that you're using a certain constraint for a reason. You're not just throwing it out there to add variation.
Yeah. So I want to come back to all three of those. We'll start at the very last one there, because that is an interesting one, because I know that, and you give, and this is one thing just straight away for any listeners, Rob does some brilliant YouTube videos on this, and one of the ones I watched most recently, Rob, was where you were actually sort of comparing information processing and the sort of ecological approach. Really great, really accessible language, and really got you thinking. But there was that, one of the sort of defining features is almost this sort of, and it clearly isn't exactly it's clearly not the case, but we do latch onto it, where it's like constraint based is all about just adapting and your adaptability, and therefore, like you said, we're just throwing all these different things in, and just hoping that we're creating, more and more adaptable players. Now I see that approach, and again, tell me if this is a different thing, but what we are now seeing popularized a lot in coaching circles is like differential training, and that's just fully like using different, and I can so understand the utility of that to an extent, but do we get carried away with that then? Because it does representativeness matter? Does, that isn't getting thrown away? So that's where people can sometimes feel that they reject this approach, and it's not necessarily that it's the approach's fault, it's the interpretation maybe.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's one thing I always say, like for both the constraint set approach and something like differential learning, the purpose of adding a constraint is not to try to recreate a condition they might face in competition, right? So for example, my sport is baseball. So I have pitchers throw balls that are larger than normal, heavier than normal, lighter than normal. Why would I want them to do that? They're never going to do that in the game. I'm not trying to get them to adapt to something they're going to face in competition. I'm trying to give them a problem to solve. And by doing that, I think it's going to help them solve. Because in my mind, and you can't anticipate every situation you're going to face in competition. So you can't train all those. So what we're going to teach you how to solve movement problems yourself, right? That's the idea. And so, yeah, I think, so I separate kind of constraint set approach, which is kind of more a principle to adding a constraint, versus differential learning, which is more just throwing some variation at the athlete. It's kind of not completely random, but there's some, it's more to get the athlete just to explore. Yeah. So that's the way I think of it. Yeah.
So is it almost try to keep one eye on the invariant principles of the game, of of the parent game that you're ultimately trying to sort of reverse engineer? It's that there's invariant principles of the game that has to be respected. It's not changing the game, it's changing the constraints that help with adaptability within the game.
For sure.
Sort of.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
The key, like you want them, the information they're using, the action they're performing. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put
it. And when you speak as well then, Rob, around this idea, because I see it, this is the thing, and you see it, this is sort of I don't know if you call it hyperbole, or there's a real rhetoric around letting them play, and
Mhm.
I get it because it's
Uh-huh.
really essential and important. But I have seen coaches, and I've been following this in the past myself, where you just continuously let a kid or an athlete, senior athlete, whoever it is you're working with, you put them in a situation hoping that they'll figure it out, that they'll self-organize.
Mm.
They don't make it, so you do them again. They don't make it, you do it again. At what point do you actually need to tell them what to do? Because does this not play a role in it? So when you say about we aren't, there's still a prescriptive nature. But is there a way of doing it that you're still offering structure without necessarily creating some
Ye-
transactional sort of, I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's that's a good point. Yeah, for sure. I think there's you don't want to let them kind of struggle forever, right? For sure, you got to give them some guidance. Um, in telling them what to do, I think there's again we try to avoid doing that like in the traditional way. We say, "Ben, do it exactly like this." I try to, what other constraints can we add, right? We want you to bend your knees more. Can we give you something, um, to something constraint that makes you bend your knees more, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Or the way it sounds like a subtle difference, but instead of telling them what to do, offering up, why don't you try doing this
Mm.
as a coach, and then getting them to explore. So kind of guiding their exploration into a new area maybe they haven't tried. That's the
Okay.
way I think of it. So yeah. So again, I don't think we want to avoid kind of telling them exactly what to do. As much as possible. But you don't want to let them struggle forever for sure. And
Mm.
as a coach, right? One of the things I think people are struggling with is I've been a coach for however long. I know what a good whatever soccer kick, a rugby pass, tennis serve looks like. Am I supposed to just throw all that knowledge away? No, I think you should use it, right? There's certain, there's certain things that have to be there in a good tennis serve. And I think you can use that knowledge to kind of add constraints or guide someone to a certain solution.
Mm. And I suppose I wonder if this might be a nice moment to, one of the questions that I wanted to ask was that, like you've said, and we know what a good soccer kick looks like,
Mhm.
or a good baseball throw, that there can seem, and I'm just saying seem because again I'm wanting to sticking with the sort of approach, the ecological dynamics approach, there can seem like there are invariant features of that still execution. However, what I found quite interesting, I was reading one of your books on this, and you spoke about there's an invariant nature of the stability of a still, but that seems to be different from in the mechanics of the still. Because I wonder,
Yeah.
is there? Could you maybe elaborate on that? Because that's where I think a lot of coaches sometimes are unsure because they're like, well, I know what, like you said, I know what a good technique looks like, so I need to help them, coach them towards that, or, but is this, that sort of flips in its head a little bit in terms of it helps with the sort of hierarchy of what we're seeing there, the stability versus the mechanic. Can you speak to that a little bit
Yeah.
more?
Yeah. There's a phrase that I like to use that we sometimes use: conditions, not positions. I know almost
Mm.
rhymes. So conditions, like when you're talking for the sports I work in, we're talking about, transferring force. Like in order to transfer the force to the ground, you need to move the force through your lower body. You need to stop the lower rotation of your lower body, put it into your upper body, then into the ball, the racket, the bat, whatever you're using. If you're going to generate a lot of force, that's the condition you need to meet. There's lots of different ways to achieve that effectively. You can bend your black leg a lot or a little. You can so moving away from the idea that you have to meet certain positions, which is the kind of traditional view of there's one ideal technique. You're looking more for, are the conditions being met? And you'll see,
The
if you do that, you
conditions.
see, and you see this when, obviously when you look at like elite soccer players, you see tons of different ways of kicking the ball, right? And there's not one perfect way to kick it, that are successful.
Mm.
But
Well, I mean,
usually they all
yeah,
meet
yeah.
kind of the properties that we're looking for.
Yeah. I mean, a nice sort of poignant example I used to always say to people as well is, I don't know how familiar you are with soccer, Rob, but like there's like ex-soccer players like Peter Crouch, who was a really tall guy,
Yeah.
very good in the air, headed the most, might be
Mm.
debatable, but I think he was very good in the air. But then there's been like others, soccer players who are really efficient in the air as well, but dead short guys, and it's kind of
Mm.
like the muscles and the way that they execute that technique, they're using different percentages or different sort of force types.
For
I'm not doing
sure.
any of that sort of jargon, but that sort of speaks to that, isn't it? It's like there's different, everyone's got a potential for execution, but how they carry that forward is going to be different based on the factors that you mentioned earlier on, the person constraints, environmental, all that
Yes,
sort of stuff together.
for sure. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
going right back to the start. Like, we don't want to try to give Peter Crouch and a 5'2" player, try to teach them the same technique for heading, right? They have hugely different individual constraints. So we want to let them find something that works for them. Yeah.
So I want to play devil's advocate here then as well, because this sort of leads on to some of the questions that I'm not want to presume this, but where there are sometimes questions that have been posed that ecological dynamics doesn't seem to always have a clear answer for. And one of the most startling ones is obviously with memory. And when we think about what helps a player get better, and this is one of the questions, and then you speak a lot around sort of live control and the way that we move towards a movement solution is based on how we seek out and I suppose recognize the affordances in our environment, and then we orientate our body towards that and control that path as best we can do. Why would we not just have the perfect technique first time then? Why is it that over time we see refinement of the execution of something? Because this is where I wonder, does some people have that question about, well, with refinement, does refinement not infer some sort of offline, memory being brought back into the equation and still execution and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think the way that I always like to do that, and I did that in that book you mentioned, is I changed the word from memory to remembering, change it from a noun to a verb. So yes, your system remembers, because in the ecological approach, with practice, you learn to pick up different information. So you use information that tells you that is a lob pass is afforded. Like, it's very complicated information based on the spacing of the players, how fast they're moving. Through practice, you learn to pick the different information up. Whereas you may use a very simple information source, how far away they are. As a novice player, that's not going to work every time. As you practice, you learn. So you learn that. So your system, you're basically developing these information movement control laws, right? So you're detecting information that says a lob pass is afforded here. Connect that to the movements that are required to get the ball in the air, right, at the same time. And so through practice, your system is remembering it's showing memory in the sense that the laws are changing, the information is changing as the system goes on. But it's not the traditional view of memory is the idea that I think people want to, I've seen this play before. I've seen when there's 3 defenders lined up like this. I did this, I'll do exactly that again, right? So you're just pulling something out of memory. This one, you're not pulling something out of memory. You're changing the way you interact with the environment based on experience. I call it remembering. So yeah.
Is this sort of like, are we remembering our adaptive capacities? Is that, I'm trying to think how we can put this into simpler. Is it remembering the capacity to adapt, or is it?
I think by remembering, I think your system is changing with experience. How you control how you control the behavior of whatever your sport is changing as you get more and more experience.
Okay.
And so it doesn't really have so we're not really pulling anything out of memory in the traditional sense to execute the skill.
And does that stay the same when we're also thinking about the advancement of like decision making and judgment? So obviously we always speak about the difference between how to do something and the sort of situated condition of when and why and where to do it. Does that follow a similar developmental pathway that can be explained through this remembering?
Yeah, I think one of the challenging things for people to understand is in the ecological approach, we don't pull those apart. Like,
so it's the
in the traditional view, you perceive information, you decide, then you act in kind of this linear progression. Whereas in the ecological approach, they're all happening at the same time. Perceiving, you're acting, how you act changes what you perceive, and then the decision just, the word we use is emerges. It just comes out of that process. So yes, as you attune into, you start to use better information to pick up affordances, that's what you're gonna use to make decision, which affordance you would try to realize, which you're trying to, should I try to make a lob pass, or should I drive to the net myself, or should I pass it back? There's always multiple options you have, and as you get improved, your decision making between which one you select is basically is going to change, and so that's going to improve as well. And that's that's kind of going back to that's one of the real kind of problems we have with a lot of practice, like the technique-based practice and skill-based. There's so few decisions people get to make in practice, right? They're always said, they're told what to do, run this play, right? In the ecological approach, we want the athlete to make the decisions by picking up information from the environment themselves, picking up these opportunities for actions, these affordances.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so there's that sort of coupling between perception and action, and versus the sort of more, we can modularize, we can take apart the strill and break it into its constituent parts, put it back together and see a different outcome. Again, I just want to play devil's advocate, not for the sake of trying to test, but more to understand where there is that response to it. I'm really curious then, can these things, is the brain, the plasticity of the brain enough that we can move between a coupling and not? Then, and I know you speak to this at volume, but it'd be interesting to kind of know how your thoughts are perhaps evolved more with I'm seeing more and more research articles starting to come out. I mean, there was one, was it Michael Ashford and Andrew Abraham and colleagues in 2021, where there is more attempts now to sort of unify some of these ways in which the brain maybe works and makes decisions. And there's been some research, the one that I quoted there, that sort of looked at this sort of fast thought, slow thought. And again, that's seen as almost like a bridge between those things, as if there's evidence to suggest that we can at times rely on mental models and other times rely on this implicit messaging of the environment. Is there an explanation that actually, from an ecological perspective, shows that this doesn't happen in one way at one time, or in another way another time? We need to view it in this, more of a tighter prism.
Yeah, for me, this goes back to James Gibson, right? The central idea of the ecological approach is there's information in the environment that directly tells you what actions are afforded, right? Based on the spacing of players, how fast they're moving, right? So there's no situation where you need a mental model to interpret the environment. Information from the environment perception is direct. It tells you, mental model is indirect perception. You're adding your previous experience, all these other things to help interpret what you see. So I don't see how you can fit those two things together, right? At the very least, right, I don't know how you'd switch between them, right? You'd have to have this monitoring system that tells you now you can be direct, now you can't. So I don't see how to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Maybe on a practical level, you can talk about, but I think everyone recognizes what we want is these adaptable players that can decide what to do, make decisions. We want good decision makers that are seeing what's in front of them. If that's where we want to get in at the end, why don't we just start there? That's why I can go that way the whole time. I don't see much value myself in introducing these. And it all speaks to how we train. Like, if you really believe in mental models, then we can spend a lot of time in classrooms drawing whiteboard. Here's the play, right? In ecological approach, that's not valuable, right? It's completely different information looking at little positions of things on the board versus actually seeing spacing between players and things. I kind of take a hard stance, but
there are I think it's straight interesting. I know it's straight interesting how you even think of that, because I think that's a good metaphor of the way that you can view things on a table, which in itself is a flat surface and very immovable. It's not very dynamic as such. And then you also sort of you mentioned, Rob, about where do we want the players to get to? Well, why aren't we actually starting there? And I suppose, is that maybe another, I don't know if you might call this a misconception as such, or rather just a tool that we have within an ecological approach, where it's not so much about that we have to take a distill apart and progress it in this linear fashion, but rather we can maybe offer more affordances in the environment than constraints, and sort of like how we manipulate the constraints more so that it allows for more success still within a dynamic environment. Is that's more of the
We
solution?
can
Because we
kind
all
of
think as coaches, as beginners, we need to work and help with them. Yeah.
a good example is in soccer is like a small-sided game, right? The small-sided game kind of creates the affordance of using space and breaking down spacing and so yeah, that's what we're trying to do really in that approach, manipulate affordances, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the model, like I guess some of the problems I have, like, do we really need a model for the whole defense, like in our head? All we're doing is deciding, can I pass between these two guys in front of me? We don't need a whole model of the whole defense. Like a model is a representation of the outside world. I don't think we really need that. It seems overkill. Like that's saying, I need a whole model of this whole room to be able to walk out of it. I don't need to model the positions and depths and distances of everything in this room to be able to walk to my door. Right?
So an athlete have any benefit then in your mind of, like, would you still tell an athlete, go and watch a game of baseball, go and watch, because there's that knowledge about, where does that sit then in the level of, is there value still attached to that?
Yeah, I think if you use
It's,
it in the right way, right? Obviously, understanding the rules, understanding, the some of the situations, I think can provide knowledge. But the most part, you need to do it, right? You need to be in the environment to be able to learn. Yeah.
I wonder if another one that been interesting. This is another one that I hear, and when I'm teaching students or other coaches, sometimes a bit different approaches to coaching. They're normally very. It's very easy for the pedagogical approach to be transferred across sports. But then whenever
Mm-hmm.
I get to a constraint-led approach, I have a kid or a student, whoever, will put their hand up and go, "I do gymnastics, or I do athletics, or I do golf.
Mm-hmm.
We struggle with this." And I wonder, and that's it. And they always say, "It just doesn't suit my sport." What would you say to that? It's for some sports and not others. Just at the end, is this more the case of the sport needing to learn, as opposed to
Yeah, I think
this
so. I think
underpinning
as we keep
knowledge?
going, it keeps going into more and more sports. Like, there's a book series, the Constraints That Approach book series, which I have a baseball book in it. But there's figure skating, swimming, golf. Like when people put their mind to it, and I think they can, for sure, it can be applied to anything. It's being applied to martial arts now, police training, so many different areas. So I think it applies to everything.
Yeah.
I think we need to recognize, right? There's certain sports. There's certain sports that are going to require more adaptability, right?
Mm,
Like playing soccer requires a lot of adaptability. Everything's
mm,
changing in front of you constantly. Sprinting in the Olympics, running the 50-meter dash doesn't require nearly the same amount, right? It's the same.
mm,
Performing, the conditions aren't varying that much, the constraints, as nearly as much as in a soccer game. But that
mm.
doesn't mean they're not. It's just a smaller degree. Yeah. So like in something like, so there are differences, definitely sports differences. And I think I think we need to take those into account, but I think you can apply it to anything.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, it might have been a video yourself, Robert. It was certainly something I've seen recently, and it was like jiu-jitsu and how they were using it, and that's
Mhm.
very much a sport that's about drilling.
Yeah.
And the reason I mention that is and I know you've made this distinction of the Newell's model, that actually the sort of ecological model can explain beyond. It's not necessarily a coaching thing, but it can explain larger things about someone's development in society.
Mhm.
Is a constraint to constraint-led coaching perhaps the culture of different sports? Because there's one thing, and there's that really interesting intersection between how a coach should act and how they can act based on the level of agreement that they're met with. And I just wonder, from your experience, is that something that's worth discussing, and how have you maybe, or at least if you're not necessarily how you've dealt with it, but how have you seen that across the landscape of sport, where it's actually about sports and maybe individuals within sports wanting to do better, but they maybe are constrained in themselves, and it's about how
Mhm.
we find the affordance in that respect to actually coach the way we
So,
want.
so how are you like how individuals kind of constrain themselves?
Yeah, to
Yeah.
some extent, and how the wider groups do as well, because it's funny that how you can apply it across levels somewhat.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a good example. Yeah, yeah, that was me. We did a kind of this I'm hearing Greg Souders, he's a Brazilian jiu-jitsu coach, is applying these ideas. So instead of teaching someone a basic technique, which is all the positions you need, he's teaching them, what are we trying to achieve? Like, what is the purpose of this? And then you do it any way you want. Here's some, you have to control your opponent. Yeah. So yeah, I think I think there's, I think we get stuck. The biggest one, I face, and this is it's sometimes called path dependency, right? It's just this, we've been doing it this way forever and ever, and I learned this way, my coach taught me that way, his coach taught him that way, so that's why we do it. That's why we do this drill. I end up asking why a lot. Why are we doing this drill? And and people just kind of, there's this kind of momentum with that. So I think that constrains them. I think we have to recognize that if you want to develop at a really high level, practice needs to be very much individualized. Right? The constraints have to be designed for you, your specific things. So we can't just generally teach everybody one thing and have it work. I know it's harder, and it's kind of, the expression I've used, it's like from Al Gore's book. It's inconvenient truth that general, you need to customize practice for individual.
But it's a really important.
I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah.
But it's really important, I think, to mention, because I think too often we don't get good enough at a method before we judge the method, and where perhaps your sport isn't naturally as aligned to this approach, or is new and maybe is familiar with it. It's like try and figure it out and explore it and stuff like that. Because I've seen the utility myself firsthand, where you don't necessarily tell a player how to do it, but you give them an outcome to reach for, and it's like they just figure it out, and it's almost a bit like magic. There are athletes, however, I sometimes think want to prescribe to a more systematic approach, and is there sometimes a reason to allow for that, if anything, just to help satisfy the needs of the player at the time? And again, this can be for reasons outside of skill acquisition. It can be confidence, it can be psychological, it can be all those sorts of things.
For sure. I get that too, with players. Some players are just used to that, and they just tell me what to do. Again, I try to use more questioning, what do you think you were doing? And then kind of, what do you think you should try? So I do, as much as possible, I try to avoid saying do this, but there are some times where you can kind of give them the idea of what they should try in a kind of a different way. But for sure, you need to be able to take those things into account.
So quite cunning. So Rob, what I want to chat about now is a lot of coaches out there, let us say, adopt this approach. And even in this question is actually just for those coaches. It's actually also for the coaches who don't adopt it, and the coaches who have their own strategy and stuff like that, but they still think they're being evidence-based. And I don't think a lot of coaches nowadays really know where the recommendations around where not to use a constraint-based approach or to use a more prescriptive information process-led approach, where the recommendations come from. And I'm talking now about in the studies, in the way that the studies are put together. And I just wonder, could you give us an insight into this? As you've performed so many of these types of studies, how do studies in skill acquisition get done? So just basically, what happens with that, so that people understand where the recommendations are given come from, so we can understand the limits of them, and also the reliability in different respects as well, depending on the way in which that information has actually been elicited.
For sure. And I think, that there are a lot of, say offhand, that there's kind of two different tensions. One is between how we're taught to run scientific studies to make them rigorous and good, valid conclusions and get them published, versus what actually happens in the real world. And those kind of, the traditional skill acquisition study, usually you find two groups of people, you recruit two groups of people, you try to balance them in terms of their skill level, their age, how much experience they have with the sport. And then you give them two different treatments, right? At least you usually want three. You want a control group too. So you might have a group where, so I've done a few studies like this where I give people more constraints-based approach, and then a group where we give them more prescriptive. We tell them this is how you swing a baseball bat, and and we give them corrective feedback. One of the limitations I see is like we to do proper experimental design, you need to give the same treatment to everybody within the group, right? So I just said you need to individualize coaching, but we don't do that at all in the research, right? We give everyone the constraints-led approach gets the exact same constraints in the exact same way. Everyone in the prescription group gets the exact same instructions, which no coach gives this every player they're working with the same cues. So it's kind of not representative in that way. And then we have a control group usually that we don't give any training. They just do their normal training. And then we run them, we train them. Usually, there's kind of also this, we have to publish a certain amount of papers, so we can't do 2-year study or something. Usually 6 weeks is kind of accepted as the minimum for a training study. We measure something about their skill before and after, identify significant changes.
Yeah, just is it something that I think there's a lot of importance to attach, not to neglect the importance of that, but I think there's certainly a lot of value to understand limitations of work that can never really, and tell me if I'm wrong, because I don't know how things have advanced, but it can never be truly naturalistic. There's always some left out just for the basis that you can't control. You have to control for certain things.
Yeah, there are a separate group of, and I've been involved in a few of these with a person named Luis Uhara, which is called contextualized skill acquisition, which is more, he does more studies where he goes in, he's done studies on Brazilian soccer, for example, where he goes in to the training facilities and he sees how he tries to document how the constraints are being manipulated. And so it's more natural. The problem is it's hard to make inferences about cause, right? We can see Brazilian kids are playing more on the beach that's uneven and which makes them more creative, but that we don't have any way to prove that was what caused that, right? We just kind of infer. So there's these kind of trade-offs, but there's usually always some kind of, to properly do a scientific study, you're going to limit, you have to limit certain things in certain ways that make
And I suppose that trade-off seems like the really important thing to assess and trying to sort of look deeper into actually where your recommendations come from. Because on one side, the more functional approach that's contextualized, great, it's in situ, but what is the cause and effect? Versus, I mean, I've read papers before, if it's sort of implicit learning, and it's like people pushing a button at certain point. And again, that's like, I mean, people will take the recommendations as we trust academia, we trust the evidence, and it's not that we shouldn't trust that, but there is a lesson to be learned around really following it back.
Yeah, that's another big limitation. More recently, it's gotten better where people are actually studying real sports skills. So they're studying the tennis serve or golf or baseball. But there's a lot of research that a lot of the skill acquisition kind of knowledge is based on people pressing buttons on a keyboard or reaching to grab an object off the table, which really are so far from what we do in sport. So they're, for example, evolving just your arm, whereas most sports skill involve you coordinate your whole body. You're no time constraints at all, whereas they have to perform a sports skill in a fraction of a second. So so there's big differences there too. But that has gotten better, and I think more recently as people are studying, as we can measure things in context with technology, I think that's helped that.
It makes me wonder, actually, and I know this is somewhat speculative, but you'd mentioned, Rob, around just the time it takes to do these sort of different simulations. I mean, with AI and technology, I could probably foresee a future where there's so much sort of computational analysis that simulations can be ran, depending if you get the controls right or you set it up in such a way that it can sort of show loads of different scenarios and test things in loads of different ways you might not be able to do with the manpower that you would have otherwise. I wonder where that might be quite interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know those simulations. The problem is once you get, how do you properly represent the people? You still need people with all their individual differences and all these effects, and you still need to show it with that. But so there are limitations, but that limitation affects both arguments.
So one thing in this, and sticking with academics here, okay. So, and being an academic myself, I understand how difficult it can be, and certainly I also understand how married we can be to our hypothesis. Now, the thing I want to ask you about now is that as people, we aren't infallible, I don't think, to bias. And what I think has came out more and more is that within the skill acquisition literature, I mean, there was a recent review done in 2021 that was that basically showed that there was confirmation bias being shown in the methodology of a lot of the way these different experiments are set up, and maybe a professional judgment and decision making versus information, other sort of information process viewed approaches or ecological dynamics. That the way these experiments are set up sort of lean themselves towards the results that would in turn confirm the paradigm that academic sits within. Or I mean, one of the recent, going back to the Ashford paper that I found quite interesting, it spoke a little bit about where a study that's maybe on ecological dynamics might been using like eye scanners, but they wouldn't maybe use interviews or verbalization. And a study that's doing information processing would maybe use interviews, but not how do we get out of a potential rut here? Because, and this is sort of like, I know this isn't necessarily an argument or a conversation that even coaches and the outside are even familiar with. It's more an academic thing. But if we are not careful, how is our need to win an argument, because people have a vested interest sometimes in their own paradigm being shown to be correct? How do we avoid the risk of that translating into recommendations and actually taking us down a rabbit hole and a path that maybe isn't all we believe it to be? Because how do you feel about that? Is it something you're conscious of, or what happens with that respect?
Yeah, I guess so. I don't think our studies are like deliberately designed to prove our response. They're deliberately designed to test the things we think matter, right? So that specific example you used, the ecological approach, we give almost zero value to interviews. Athlete telling you what they thought they did a week ago on the pitch, what they remembered they were doing is not.
What about like think aloud type stuff, where it is about, I know again there's obviously a time delay in some respects, but is there any value to that maybe?
Not a really I don't think so, in the same, like the way people, or maybe with some of the stuff, how they're self-regulating and things, but not what they're actually deciding and doing. I don't think so. So, like I said, a lot of my studies I'm working with like college athletes or something. So it's like an investment in I want to do something that's going to make them better. So I'm going to do what I believe will make them better. And I'm not going to measure a bunch of things that I don't think are important. The part of the issue is what you measure and what you think is valuable, I think, from the data. But yeah, I guess, I don't, that's why, I've kind of, I don't know if there's ways to truly distinguish these different approaches and in a study. I don't think anybody would be happy. There's no study that would make everybody happy. I think you'd always get arguing about it. Yeah. And so so that's kind of the limitation I see with that. I want it's hard enough, and I don't know, in doing studies where you work with a team, like convincing, like if I really say I want to work with you because I really believe this constraint set approach is going to help you play. It's hard enough just to get a control group, right? Yeah. To tell them, okay, half the players aren't going to get this thing that I think I just told you is the greatest things ever. They're like, what? So no, I want you to do with all my players. So there are a lot of kind of practical constraints like that. But yeah, I guess I recognize that. I don't think I think always, there's that Ashford and this idea that you can be atheoretical. I think is nonsense, right? You always have a theory in mind that you test. That's how we do science, right? So that you can be completely objective and view the world without any bias at all. I don't think we can do that. So why? I don't know. I think that's what they're arguing for, but I don't see how you can do that.
Yeah. You could flip that in the same way and say that, if we do combine all these methodologies into a study, that in itself is part of another paradigm that's and that doesn't really fit it. So it's difficult. Maybe the only path forward for that is, I suppose, is just that as coaches, maybe going back to my initial reason for asking these questions, as coaches, we need to sort of observe the information as best we can ourselves, I suppose, and that might be where you go to different sources to see things in different ways. And I just know that the natural human nature of coaches to try everything, because that's a very popular term in coaching, and maybe that's where we start to get into this messy area of, well, why aren't we? And then It's a hard one. It's difficult.
Yeah, there's kind of this view. Response I get a lot of coaching is I don't have a theory of coaching. I just do what works,
Mm-hmm.
right? But when you kind of dig a bit, they do have a theory of coaching, right? If
Mm,
you are getting your athletes to repeat dribbling around cones over and over, then you believe learning works one way versus having them do small sided games. So yeah, I think I'm sympathetic with that. The coach, right? The coach just needs results, right? They're not trying to advance the theory and stuff. The problem I always try to sell is that this ecological approach constraints up doesn't limit you in the methods you can use. It's just giving you a structure and a framework for how to use them consistently, how they're going to build on each other. Right? That's what I try to sell in the groups I work with. Like let's use them consistently. Let's not have, we do one practice session where we're letting them self-organize, then we do a different one where we're going to tell them what to do. Those are kind of compete. They're going to interfere with each other. So let's try to be consistent. Yeah.
I think that's a really good sort of midway point, I suppose, is that it's how you use it. It's not taking away your use. I see that a lot of time because any coach, it certainly is they're gaining expertise. Sometimes we don't want to lose our toolkit, our best sessions, because it's like it's like an anchor point for us, and that's what we're good at. And that's quite a useful thing. I think you said there all about how we can actually. It's just a way of using it, and again, it's just how you tweak your current approach rather than necessarily throwing everything out. Of course, there could be certain things around the lines and stuff like that.
I think Also, I think we need to think about what we mean by our best sessions as a coach. Like if everyone does exactly what you told them perfectly, that looked great and you felt that was your best session, but they probably learned absolutely nothing.
Well,
Right?
Well, there's an argument, and I see sometimes, and I wonder how you feel about this, where I've seen coach developers and I've worked with coaches, and where they have a session that they will carry around with them and they will lay down, and there's other people that actually say, and maybe that coach has like a database and they store all their session plans and stuff. But there's another coach that might then say you should never do the same session twice. And if you're really being individualistic and you're really thinking about so where would you lean that side to? That's an interesting thing. Just
probably
there is that assumption.
Never exactly the same twice. I would think you want to adapt it and what you're seeing in front of you and the players you have at that moment. For sure.
Does that then? How do we marry that then? Because that then has quite a certain level of, if not expertise or some sort of progression of your ability as a coach, certainly your confidence to do things that are new. How do we get new coaches to embrace an ecological design then? Because I wonder, because there's a certain level of comfortability that comes with being able to take a session online, and I wonder if you're fighting against this or not, because that's an interesting point.
The resistance I have a lot of times are people, show me examples, show me the drills, show me. The problem I have with that is coaches will just think, I'll just copy those exactly. Those exact drills that you use, I'll use them with my athletes, which is missing the point a bit. That you want to design constraints based on what your individual athletes you're working with need. So yeah, I think I think it does. I think initially just kind of exploring this, try adding some variability, try adding some constraints and not saying much and see what comes out. And then, keep learning, keep exploring and learning how you can manipulate these. But that takes a while. The kind of just copying a constraint manipulation you've seen somewhere is fairly easy. You can do that right away. But getting to the point where you can design, for example, a small-sided game to get your team to move the ball to the other side of the field more to create scoring, like a very specific thing you want to get from your team. That takes a lot of skill and practice.
And I suppose it makes you think maybe there's a bit of a radical overhaul needed in the way that certainly formal coach education that speaks to or is projected on the masses, the way that is very content driven. It's very much here, show and do, where this is more of a here's principles, here's how we can manipulate things, here's the effect, let's try it. Let's see and let's change who's in front of us. Let's see how that impacts things and what you need to do. That's a problem setting thing, and I think coaches want problem solving things. And that's
And going back to the start, a way that I like to sum up all this is, this method of coaching is giving athletes problems, not solutions. Right?
Yeah.
So it's very hard and it's very hard psychologically as a coach. You're letting go a lot of the control, right? That you know all the answers. It's very hard for coaches to get used to that.
Yeah. So I'm conscious of your time, Rob. I just want to ask this question because
okay.
I think everyone asks this question nowadays. I'd started to hint at it a little bit. AI, is this a new constraint? Is artificial intelligence? What are you thinking about? Where's the future still acquisition with technology? And perhaps is referring back to ecological design as well. What's your thoughts been in this space at the moment?
I think some of the kind of looking at the way we do analytics and the way we break down, I think we can use that from an ecological perspective to look at, our player instead of, how many passes did they make, how many shots did they, which is done now from video. What affordances are they taking? Was that the best choice in that situation? Was these kind of things. So there are already some efforts to do that. So I think the episode I did a couple of weeks ago, I talked about some models of that. So I think there are some interesting things we could potentially.
Yeah, if anything, at least for conversation starters, I suppose, and that nudging towards certain, sort of affordances. No, it's excellent, Rob. No, again, I really value your time. Rob, is there some places that perhaps we can promote? Because I'm quite an avid listener of your sort of perception, action podcast that you've got. Where can people that are tuning in listen to that? Also, can we maybe, if you want to maybe give a little quick shout out for the different books that you've got as well, where might we start with that? I've started on learning the optimized movement. Could we start before that onwards? I'm quite interested for the people who want to, who follow you already or maybe haven't been as aware of you. How can we keep them going in that respect?
So just a quick, you can find basically everything at perceptionaction.com. Has the podcast, my books. Yeah, my books, I wrote kind of my first book, How We Learn to Move, is meant to be a kind of introduction to the logic and the theory of ecological dynamics, getting kind of beyond not getting too deep into the terminology and the complicated stuff. And then the one you mentioned, the Learning to Optimize Movement, is getting a bit deeper on all these. Yeah, those are the main. And then there's a link to my YouTube channel and all those things. So yeah, perceptionaction.com is kind of where you can find it. One-stop shopping.
Brilliant. No, and thanks so much. I think there's a lot that can be kind of taken from today. I think certainly in terms of understanding some of these misconceptions and again, it's great, and I really appreciate your sort of rebuttal to what I was sort of speaking around the methodology, because it's so true in a way that when we see that people are identifying bias, well, it's again, we aren't going to remove that as such, and maybe this isn't about everybody making up. This is actually just about coaches becoming more independent in the way that we take in information, and that's why I think it's really cool that you were able to talk us through how skill acquisition experiments are put together. What do they care about? What are the limitations of it? I think that's really useful for a coach to understand.
I think it's important for sure.
Yeah, it's just great. So, no, excellent, Rob. So thanks so much for coming along. Yeah. Okay. So thanks guys for listening. I hope that was as useful for you as it certainly was from me. So until next time.